Okay. We are live.
All right, well, welcome. Good to see you guys today. Glad you chose to be with us. We're in our second session of the Friendswood ISD Parent Power Forum. So it's my pleasure to get to be with you today. And so my name is Chris Alston, and I've been back in the community for the last 18 years after being raised just down the road in Alvin for the first 18 years of my life. And so raised in the 70s and 80s in Alvin, and so it's good to be back in this area. And so I'm a pastor in the community. I pastor at Clear Creek Community Church. I'm right here in Friendswood. I'm moving into our permanent facility on 528 here at Christmas Eve. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here today because we're going to be looking at the topic of understanding the journey of adolescence, specifically, you know, for you as parents, what's your role in this process? And so I've got a little bit of an experience with this. My wife and I have been married for 30 years this next year. We have 3 daughters, ages 19, 23, and 26, as well as 2 granddaughters, one that is 6 years old and another one that will be here in March. And so we have a little bit of experience raising children. And so I always think about when you're doing a parenting conference, it's always better to do a parenting conference either before you have kids because you're idealistic, or after you've raised them because now you at least have some realistic expectations of what it looks like to raise children, because right in the middle of it is pure chaos. And so looking forward to being with you guys today. I also have come, I'm here today because this is one of my passions. So I did my doctoral studies in youth and family and culture, and it really has been spent a lot of time in research on understanding the adolescent journey. And so what my goal would be today is to be able to share with you not only my personal experiences raising children, but also some of my research that we've learned along the way. And so that's what we're going to be doing as we spend our times together. I don't make any assumption that I've got teenagers figured out. We have been far from perfect as parents, and so I come at least with that preface that we're coming at it as fellow journeys, fellow travelers along the way. I can remember specifically in our parenting, like we were reflecting on a weekend around the house with our teenagers, and my wife said to one of my daughters, she said, "Man, it's just been so peaceful around here this week. Thank you guys for really just keeping the peace." And my oldest daughter looked at her and said, "Mom, I wasn't even home all weekend." And I think we realized right then there was the reason for some of the peace that we were experiencing in our home. And so I know when I asked my daughters over the years when I would do these kind of seminars, like, "Hey, what should I say about the teenage years to those that I'm talking to?" And inevitably my daughters would just say, "Just tell them it's complicated." And so we know that it is complicated, and glad that you chose to be with us today. So I want to share with you some of my experiences, but ultimately, here's my burden. I love teenagers. I love the adolescent journey. I love what that looks like in the lives of the students, from really those awkward junior high years to those high school years where they're starting to figure out a little bit of their own independence to ultimately where they move into adulthood. I just love the journey, but I also want to resource and equip parents because for most of us, it's a really challenging journey along the way. And so hopefully by the end of the day, and then we'll be able to cover some things that maybe you've had on your own mind and on your own heart when it comes to raising teenagers. You'll have the opportunity to ask some questions, and hopefully we'll get to some of your questions along the way. So let me give you a little overview of where we're going in our time together. And so we're going to take a look at really understanding the adolescent journey, because there's something to understand there, right? It's a unique season of life for our children, and so we want to take some time to fully understand that. We also want to look at what is it that an adolescent really needs, and so we'll dig into that a little bit so that we have a better understanding for our own children that we get to be a part of. Like what are their real needs during the season of their lives, and then ultimately what is a parent's role in that process. And so that's where I want to journey with us today. But I come to you specifically with this premise, that adolescents are not a problem to be solved, but creative, talented, and unique gifts to be understood, embraced, and ultimately set free. And I say that because I've been there, and at times I'm like, can we just fix this kid? Can we fix this situation? And we say that often, sometimes because it's created some discomfort in our own home. It's maybe taken me out of my comfort place. Or maybe there's a real issue going on in the life of my kid and I just want them to be fixed. And so I really want to dismiss that, say, you know, our children, obviously, they're not a problem to be solved, but they are creative and talented and unique gifts that hopefully that we're going to take and we're going to love and we're going to nurture and we're going to understand and we're going to embrace them And ultimately, we get to release them. We get to set them free into this world, hopefully and prayerfully as healthy adults. And so that's the premise that I want to come at you with today. And so I want you to walk away understanding adolescence, understanding your role in the process, because here's what I know. It's hard to be a parent today. I mean, it's not easy. I think about all the technology changes that have happened, not only just all the things that have been going on in our world that we're all familiar with as well, but even just think technology alone, it's just hard to be a parent today. I came across this comic the other day that I think describes it. It says, your mother and I, we found out you've been blogging. We don't know what that means, but we need you to stop it. And so I don't know if you've ever found that as a parent, where like your kid has found the next social media craze or the next Snapchat or the next Facebook or whatever it might be. And as parents, sometimes we're always behind the eight ball on that. And so being a parent is hard because of just the rapid rate of change that takes place in our culture today. It's just difficult for us to keep up with it, as well as the adolescent developmental cycle in general. So it's hard to be a parent today. I would also say for a lot of our educators, I'm grateful for our education system. I mean, it's difficult to be a teacher today as well. I mean, if you think about this, I don't know if our kids are getting smarter or they're just getting more smart-aleck, right? And so, I mean, here's a great image of what that might look like. But I'm grateful for our educators. I'm grateful that you're sticking it out with us, because as parents, we need your partnership in that. And so today, as we talk about understanding the adolescent journey, we also need to realize it's hard to be a kid today. I think it's harder to be a teenager today than probably any other time in history. And what I find for most adults that I talk to that are in my season of life or raising kids, they're like, sometimes we divert to a thought process like, well, we were all kids once. We were all teenagers once. We all went through high school once. And yet the reality is, not in this world, not in the world that our students today are going through. And so part of understanding the adolescent journey is not just assuming that we understand it, because we didn't grow up in this day and age. We grew up in a completely different day and age, and we all have our stories, right? I mean, like, we had to walk to school uphill through the snow both ways, right? Our kids get that. We all experienced high school prom probably, or homecoming and all that kind of stuff, but it's just a different world that we live in today. I was doing some research, and I find it interesting about kind of the world that we live in today, and really what our kids are experiencing that they've always just assumed was normal. So, for instance, computers have always fit in their backpacks, right? I mean, I remember getting my first computer coming out of college, and yet kids have always carried computers in their backpack. Social media has always been at their fingertips. It's always been just right there. That's just part of their world. It wasn't part of my world. It probably wasn't part of your world growing up as a high school student. Photographs have always been digital. Now, I can remember, my daughter was probably, I won't even give her age away, but I can remember she came up to us one day and said, hey, I want one of those picture thingies that's on paper. I mean, we're talking like, you're talking about a photograph? Like, she had never felt a photograph on a piece of paper, because her entire life, I mean, every photograph, every picture she'd ever seen was in a digital format. I think it's in every, so we didn't grow up in this world. An automatic is a weapon, and it's not a transmission in today's world. They've never rolled down a car window, if you think about that. And then they've always grown up with bottled water. So it's a different world. Like, I'm not sure, even if the sprinkler system was on outside, my kids would probably die of thirst, because they wouldn't even know what it was like to drink out of a water hose. And so we're living in an accelerated rate of change. And so we need to try to understand the world that our kids are growing up in. And the older that we get, the more critical that we become of those coming behind us. And so we often forget maybe even some of our own struggles, some of our own journey. But as I said, this is a different world that our children are growing up in today than we ever grew up in. And so we're going to be talking in general, not about one specific child's story, but we're going to take a macro look at kids, kind of that whole helicopter perspective. And so many of you, I understand, you're probably highly trained professionals when it comes to raising your kids, but I'm going to ask you just to posture yourself as a learner today as we begin to look at some of these changes that affected our children over the years. And so let me just start with section 1 that we're going to look at today in our time together, that I'm just calling the adolescent journey. And so what is adolescence anyway? Like, where did that phrase come from? And so let me just give you the root behind that. The Latin word, it comes from a Latin word called adolescere, which literally means to grow into. And so, and that word wasn't even coined until 1904 by what's now known as the father of adolescent developmental psychology, G. Stanley Hall. And so it's an interesting word that really didn't even come onto our radar until just a little over 100 years ago. And I'll explain a little bit later, why that's true, that wasn't part of our history, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago. And so it literally means to grow into. And what I want to do today is try to answer the question, because sometimes we don't even know in today's world, like, when does adolescence start? Like, how do we know? Like, we're not in a culture typically that we have these different rites of passages, so it can even become confusing to think about, like, well, when does this season that we call adolescence, when does it really begin and when does it really end? And so think about it like this. So when is one in our culture truly an adult? I think that's a fair question to ask, because if we're saying adolescence is a unique season of life, when are they out of this season of life? And so it's interesting when you look at our culture, because here's what our culture would say. They say you become an adult when you're age 25. That's when you get to rent a car. I can remember going on my honeymoon before I was 25, and I couldn't even rent a car. I could be married, but I couldn't rent a car. Or if you're going to have alcohol, like, you're considered an adult at age 21. If you're going to join the military, you're considered an adult at age 18. If you're going to get a driver's license, you're considered an adult at age 16. If you want to eat off of the kids menu, you're considered an adult at age 10, right? It can get worse than that. You're considered an adult at age 2. If you want to fly on an airlines, they're going to pay you full price at age 2. So the question really becomes, when is someone an adult? And so I want to help answer that in light of what one of the developmental psychologists I've studied talked about. He says it like this. This is John Santrock in his book, Adolescence. He said this. He said, adolescence begins in biology and ends in culture. Now, what that means is that adolescence, the season of adolescence, is not really a numerical number per se, but it's when biology begins, specifically when it comes to puberty, when puberty begins, and then it ends when culture says it ends. So at the onset of puberty, and then whenever culture identifies someone as an adult. And so what we're going to see over the last 100 plus years, how that's even changed over time. And so you'll begin to understand the adolescent journey in light of that. So let me talk to you in light of this whole idea of a tightrope of adolescence. So if you've been to a circus, you've seen the tightrope, you've seen the people walk across that tightrope. And so I want to begin to look at this in light of what is that tightrope that children have to walk across, called adolescence, until the time that they actually become official adults. And so let me show you a little bit of a history on this. And so up until about 1900, we were children up until about the age of 14 or 15. And then we immediately became adults at about the age of 15 or 16, right? So up until 1900, that's just kind of the way it was. There was no season of adolescence. And why was that? Well, because you started puberty around 14 or 15, and right about that time, you were just kind of escorted directly into the workforce, whether it be in your agrarian society where you worked alongside mom and dad, or it was into some kind of a factory life where you began to work, and you just began your trade as soon as you were considered old enough, which typically was at the beginning of puberty, to enter into the workforce. And so there really was no adolescent season. And so we didn't even talk about this season of life up until about 1900. And then up until then, typically kids would go to school between kindergarten and 8th grade, and only about 1% of the population even went on to what we would even consider a high school education. So it really was a simple hop, skip, and a jump across the tightrope, even if there was one, from childhood into adulthood. Well, between 1900 and 1970, we began to see things pushing and extending adolescence. And so as the societies developed and matured, children and sometimes became tools to be used rather than people to be developed, or even a nuisance to be pushed aside. And so what we began to see over the next 70 years in our society was kids just began to kind of be thrust into this workforce, and yet it wasn't always helpful for them. And so that's when they had the establishment of child labor laws, which were very specific about, kind of restricting the opportunities for young people to work, as well as education laws, because there was a growing public concern over child labor, and specifically there was concern in the belief that the compulsory attendance at school would discourage factory owners from exploiting children. So there was this expanding time that now kids were pulled back out of the workforce and entered into kind of more of a public school setting. And the result was there was decreased youth employment and increased school attendance. And so in 1920-ish or so, really we began to see the institution of the high school. So that was a change. And then if you remember what was happening in our nation between the 1930s and 1970s. Some of you history buffs will pick up on it pretty quickly, but we experienced the Great Depression in the 30s, World War II in the 40s, the Korean War in the 50s, and societal upheaval of the Vietnam War in the 60s and in the 70s. And all of these just upheavals in our society, not to mention all the other things I just mentioned, they began to cause Americans to focus less and less on the nurture of our young and more on survival. And thus began to develop this lengthening of what we call the tightrope of adolescence. And so this tightrope of adolescence began to stretch out from really began to see childhood end about the age of 13, and they would call that early adolescence, and it was actually extended out well past high school to about the age of 18 to what then was known as late adolescence. So you can just see in just a very short amount of time in history, we went from really no adolescent season, no adolescent tightrope, to a tightrope of about 5 years. That, maybe for some of us, that was kind of the job. That was kind of our story, right? We kind of became children, went through a little short season of adolescence, and then entered into the workforce. So, have you seen this lengthening going on in maybe some of the environments that you're involved in? Because it continued to be able to lengthen. So from 1970 up into the 2000s, we began to see the technological revolution where just things continued to kind of move at a rapid pace. And then this is an interesting diagram, because what was a 5-year season of adolescence became then a 15-year season of adolescence. So again, put yourself in a child's shoes that now has to make their trek from childhood for the next 15 years before they're considered an adult across what would be considered a pretty tumultuous season called adolescence. Now, you probably have questions like, well, how come it lengthened? Like, what made it start earlier? What made it go longer? And so there are some theories out there. I don't know if I have all the answers to all those theories, so I'll just start on this end. So why did we go from 14 years old to 11 years old being the onset of puberty? I don't really know the answer to that. Some would say that we're putting too many hormones in our chicken. And so that's increased our children beginning puberty at an early age. Some would say we're in an over-sexualized culture, which has kicked into puberty at earlier ages. So we're not really sure, but for any of us that have children that have walked through the season, we can see that they're beginning puberty at earlier and early ages. And I'm not assuming that's going to go all the way down to 5 years old, but I am assuming that it has moved down to a younger age group. And then the question, obviously, and then why is it lasting longer? Well, you've probably seen it yourself, right? I know many people that have their own businesses that the 18-year-olds they used to hire, they're not sure they want to hire those 18-year-olds today because they just don't seem to be living into some of the adult values that 18-year-olds lived into 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so we begin to see that in our culture. Some would say that the lengthening of adolescent season comes through really what would be termed systematic abandonment. Some of the systems that were meant to nurture our children from childhood into adulthood in a very healthy way, some of those systems have begun to erode and begin to decay in our society. One of those would be the family system. There are other systems that we could look at and go, they're no longer there to benefit children. Potentially, they're there to use children. And so some of the systems that once maybe were more healthy, today we see a level of unhealth that is now lengthening that adolescent season. And so what I want to talk to you about, though, is in this season of adolescence, how do we understand these kids? Like specifically, what do we understand about these early adolescents that are going from the ages 11 to about age 14? Or what do we understand about these teenagers that are in their high school years? Or really those that are, we call them young adults, but they're really in a late adolescent season as they move off into college or into some kind of a trade. And so how do we understand them? And so what I want to look at with you today is, just to kind of give you some understanding, is some of the psychosocial development that's going on, the cognitive developments that's going on, some of the relational development, as well as just some of the the physical changes that are taking place in those seasons. So let me start with early adolescence. So in early adolescence, again, these are those fun junior high age kids. And so let me just help you understand this group of kids a little bit more. So one of the things is very, very rare about this season is this is when puberty begins. And so here you have the group of kids that are changing physically like never before. Outside of birth itself, puberty is the greatest change that anyone's body will ever go through. And so here we have this group of kids that they're experiencing such radical changes physically that is part of the reason that they act out in ways that they do, because there's this change that's going on in their bodies physically that we probably as adults can't even remember the time when we went through that ourselves. Not only that, there's some significant cognitive changes going on. They're really beginning to move into what's called a concrete, probably on the latter stages of concrete operational thinking, which means the child is now mature enough to use logical thought or operations, if you will, but they can only apply logic to physical objects. And so it's this concrete operational thinking, which leads them to be in a season of development, really psychological development, where they're very eye-focused. And so we would simply say that they're egocentric, because in their minds, that's all they can think about. Like they literally are egocentric. They literally are eye-focused because their brains only think about themselves. I think about what psychologist David Elkind phrase. He calls it an imaginary audience. And so think about it like this. This group of kids in this season of life, they live with an imaginary audience, meaning everybody sees everything that I do. And so they're super self-conscious about what everybody thinks about them, even though it might be two people that are witnessing something. They have an imaginary audience in their mind that everybody is seeing them. And so I can remember actually going through a Target store with my early adolescent daughter, and she was needing to purchase some feminine hygiene products, and yet she thought the whole store was watching her purchase these products, and so there was no way she was going to walk through the store carrying those, because in her mind there was an imaginary audience and the whole store knew what was going on her. This is what they live with cognitively. Not only that, David Elkind says that they also live with a personal fable, and their personal fable is this. It's like, nobody understands me, because nobody's ever experienced what I've experienced before. And so they really do think that they're on an island experiencing something for the first time that nobody else has ever experienced before. And so you can imagine being an 11 or 12, 13-year-old young man, young woman, and cognitively, this is what you're feeling. These are some of the things that are going on in your mind. And so as parents, you have to begin to understand that. You got to understand why your child is feeling that way. And at times it's fun just to even play with that, right? So I love this picture here. Let me see if I can get there. Why is that not addressed? There we go. Here we go. It says, so for every day that your math grade stays below a B, your father will post a video of himself on YouTube, right? So as a parent, you can have some fun with kids in early adolescence because they already think everybody's noticing everything going on about them anyway. And so you can have fun with that if you're a creative parent when it comes to that. Well, and also, let me just finish this with early adolescence. So when it comes to their psychosocial development, they are moving into really what's called a discovery phase, specifically when it comes to love and relationships, because for so long in their development, they went and did what mom and dad told them to go and do. So it's like, I'm going to take you over to a friend's house and you're going to play with that friend. All of a sudden, their world's starting to open up in the junior high years, where they're actually getting to choose friends on their own. They're actually getting some extended time in relationships, whether it be at an after-school event or some extracurricular activity, that they've never had that level of freedom before. And so they're beginning to experience kind of some of this discovery thing. Love and relationships are starting to kind of blow up in their mind a little bit more, where they can see that they have some ways to meet new people. And then I would say, just in closing, that one of their questions that I've always found this age group is really asking is this: do you like me? And they're asking that question because when they look into the mirror and they see their changing bodies, they're not sure they even like themselves. They're experimenting in relationships with people, like trying to find some new friendships, and maybe they're being rejected by some of those friendships for the first time, and they're asking the question, do you like me? And so I always try to keep that in mind as I spend time with junior high students, is that one of the things that they want to know more than anything else is that you like them. Like, you understand that this is an awkward season. You understand that they're going through some incredibly unique changes in their life, and yet they're liked by you. And so I think that's an interesting phase. But now let me turn our attention to not only the early adolescent phase. What do we need to know and understand about this middle adolescent phase? If you've got an early high schooler, this is a really unique phase of life. And so typically I think this is kind of what I think about when I think about the high school phase of life, is this image right here. It's like, this is called a parent's guide to the facial expressions of the species, right? So if you have a kid in high school and you go, how's your day? They go, fine. How'd your activities go? Good. Did you have a good time with your friend? Yeah. Right? I mean, so if you've had a high school student, you might have experienced this in your conversations with them, because that's kind of the facial guide of the species when it comes to the middle adolescent. But I want to explain a little bit what's going on cognitively, what's going on physically, what's going on relationally. Okay? And so take a look. They have now moved into what psychologists would say is an egocentric abstractionism. And so what egocentric abstraction is really this idea that, well, first off, puberty is continuing on, right? They're becoming young men, young women. This egocentric abstractionism cognitively is basically saying, okay, I'm starting to recognize that other people exist. Whereas as an early adolescent, I didn't even know other people exist. As a high school student, I'm actually beginning to recognize that other people exist, but I don't care, right? So, I mean, that's kind of what they're beginning to go through. Is like they start to see that people matter, and yet there's still this strong draw for self-preservation, that they are still the primary audience that they're focused on. Author Donald Miller writes about it in reflecting on his own season of egocentric abstraction. He says like this: it is like in that movie about a boy where Nick Hornsby, chief character played by Hugh Grant, believes that life is a play about himself and that all other characters are only acting minor roles in a story that centers around him. He said, my life felt like that. Life was a story about me because I was in every scene. And so I think that's true for middle adolescents, is that they happen to be in every scene of their story. Therefore, there's a little bit of egocentrism that's going on in that. And the I thou focus is really the idea that they do begin to see that other people exist. And yet there's this self-protection that they still want to take care of themselves. I would also say they're moving into that kind of concrete abstract thinking, where they're no longer just concrete thinker. They're really beginning to grasp some abstract thought. And so they're beginning to move cognitively into that. Part of that abstract thought, though, begins for them to see some things in our culture. Specifically, when I talked about some of the systematic abandonment that some of our kids have felt in the past, high schoolers begin to see all those connecting dots to go, wow, maybe some of these adults in my life really have disappointed me. Maybe I was feeling used by that individual or in that situation. And so that all creates in their minds this feeling where they really begin to develop a lack of trust. And so what I would say in that season of life is they're struggling to trust people in authority. They're struggling to trust some of their parents. And what makes this a unique stage of development is their newfound ability to reflect on both the pain of the past experiences and the glaring duplicity demonstrated by the adults in their lives. And so they're starting to be able to see that more keenly than they did as junior high students. And so psychosocially, they're beginning to negotiate themselves in relationships. And I would think at the end of the day, their question isn't, do you like me, but do I like you? And so it takes a while to win over a high school student, where I think it's a whole lot easier sometimes to love a junior high student, because if you love them, they love you back. But because of maybe lack of trust that some high school students feel towards those in authority, we have to earn trust in their lives. So that's the first two phases of this lengthening adolescent tightrope. Let me give you the third phase. The third phase is what's called late adolescence. And really it's best depicted in this 2006 movie with Matthew McConaughey called Failure to Launch. So if you know many 18-year-olds, 25-year-olds, we're finding in our society today, there's been a significant failure to launch. But let me give you a few things that are going on in this stage of life as well. One, their abstract thought is beginning to kick in, so they're beginning to be able to see the world in a totally different light. They're developing their core self. They're starting to understand who they are and what they want to do in this life. They're beginning to be emerging into adulthood and trying out adult relationships and adult jobs. And so they're beginning to emerge into that as well. And really what they're going to be valuing in this season is a season of experimentation and exploration. And so that kind of gives you just the big picture, if you will, of some of the key things that are taking place in this season. Now let me just sum it up with this though. So what's the goal? What's the goal of moving from childhood into adulthood? What should be our goal for this season for those in our lives that fall into the category of adolescence? Well, what we would say is the goal of adolescence is individuation. Individuation really is you're becoming a unique individual. That's what the goal is. You're giving students, you're giving children space to become a unique individual. And let me help you understand how that might look, because there's really three questions that you want every child to be able to answer, every adolescent to be able to answer, so that when they do enter into adulthood, there's some health there. So let me give you the three things that need to happen in this individuation process. Here's the first one. The first one is they need to be able to answer the question, who am I? Like that's the question of identity, because they need to be able to come out of adolescence and be able to understand that they're a unique individual. And so that's one of the questions that they're going to be able to ask. And so you can see in that adolescent season, they're trying this out, right? I mean, they're trying on personalities, they're trying on outfits, they're trying on styles, they're trying on different music genres. They're still trying to figure out in many ways who they are. And so part of parenting, and we'll get into that in a minute, but really part of parenting is allowing your kids some space, right? To really figure out who they are, to really begin to develop who their core self is, so that when they get into adulthood, they're not still trying to figure out themselves. The second thing that they need to figure out during this season is do I and my choices matter? There's a sense of responsibility that they need to figure out now, because we want them as healthy adults to know that their decisions matter. And so, should I allow a friend to cheat? Well, there's two things that are going on in a kid's life when they come with that scenario, right? Am I loyal to my friend, or do I do what is the right thing to do? And so they have to begin to figure those things out now, because they recognize that their choices really do matter for even bigger decisions that they're going to face in the future. I think about this in light of parenting, because you have some parents during this season that are just overwhelmed. I mean, it's an intense season, and I would just say sometimes they choose to become the absent parent. Like, hey, I'm just going to let my kid be an adult. They can make whatever decisions they want. They can do whatever they want. I'm washing my hands of this. This is too hard. And they become the absent parent. On the other hand, though, you have some of those parents that are so scared that their kids are going to make any poor choices that they make all the choices for them, and we would call them the helicopter parent, right? Because they're hovering over their kids with every decision that's ever made. I would say that those are both the extremes. Like, you don't want to be a helicopter parent because you need to allow your kids to make some choices that matter. And you don't want to just dismiss it because they still need your guidance. They still need your direction. They still need your wisdom. And so there's got to be a middle ground. But this is one of the things that we have to see happen if we're going to move from adolescence into a healthy adulthood. And then the third one is this. They need to be able to answer the question, where do I fit? It's the whole idea of belonging. Do they know that they have a people that they belong to, that they are known and they are loved and they are wanted? And so we want them to get to the place as an adult where they're not continuing trying to search for themselves, but they begin to answer in a healthy way some of these key questions. And so the whole idea of systematic abandonment, where there's been systems that have no longer supported our kids, we want to be able to come along our kids in a way that loves them and cares for them, but in the unique season that they're going through. I find this interesting. And so in the past, children were accepted and they were received because they were part of the community. That's the whole sense of belonging. They were just ours, right? It's like, I mean, we raised the whole community together. And yet, because of some of the breakdown in our society today they're welcomed when and if they perform well enough to be accepted. And so what we found is we're in a society where students are feeling the stress of having to perform even just to be accepted by a community. And that's a heavy burden for these students to be able to carry. Not only that, today they're welcomed when and if they conform enough to be accepted. It's like they're accepted if they dress the way we want, or they wear their hair the way we think they ought to wear it, or they act in appropriate ways that we think they ought to act. Then we accept them into the community. And we got to be careful as adults. Like, are we just a works-based acceptance for the kids that have been given to us to love and to trust and to nurture? And so then lastly, today they are welcomed when and if they portray an image that is pleasing enough to be accepted. So I give you all that, and we're going to wrap up kind of that whole first phase here, is because I wanted us to just at least start with a basic general understanding of the adolescent journey, the fact that it is lengthening, the fact that there's some unique phases along the way. And so whatever phase your child might find themselves in, you treat them a little differently. You begin to understand them a little differently. You walk with them a little bit differently. And I'll get into specifically how do you walk with them. And so my desire is that you would be an agent of change who will turn the tide away from some kind of a systematic abandonment that your kids might be feeling to ultimately it'd be an intentional engagement in the life of today's teens. And so that's the first stage. So I don't know if there's any questions that have come in that we need to take some time and answer before we move on to our next section.
I don't see any questions, just people enjoying what you're saying so far.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a joy to be able to share with you. Let me jump into the next thing. So here's where we're going to go next is what do adolescents need? What do adolescents need? And so I'm going to just kind of take you through a little grid because I think it's interesting as we look through this grid because even sometimes what they say isn't exactly what they're saying. So what does an adolescent need? Here's what they say, and I want to point to the fact of what they really mean when you hear some of these phrases because I'm guessing you've heard some of these phrases in your own home. First one is this: you don't know me. Like what students are really saying in that moment is, I need a place to belong. Like that's part of their need, is a need to belong. That's what they're trying to figure out in this season. And so oftentimes when we feel like just like nobody knows me, nobody cares or anything like that, they're really saying to us they need to belong. Number two, you never listen to me. What they mean is, second to the last one is, it's my life, you can't tell me what to do. What they're really saying is, I need to be uniquely me. Like when we try to, again, over-control all their decisions, they need to feel some level of being able to be unique. And then the last one on this grid would be this: nobody cares about me, and what they're really saying is, I need to be wanted. And so as parents and as a community of caring adults, we at least need to begin to listen to what are our kids, what are our adolescents saying, but specifically, what do they need in light of what they're saying? And so I wanted to give you that before we jumped into kind of really the parent's role in this whole process, okay? So here's the last phase that I want us to walk into. What is a parent's role? And I would extend that out to say, what is a community's role? Because for maybe some of you watching, it's like your kids are already grown, and yet you still play a role in loving adolescence into adulthood. And so I want to give you the essentials in the role of parenting because you're setting the stage for how you will deal with more difficult decisions in the future. Here's what I mean by that. I've been through these seasons, right? And when my kids were young and trying out things, I thought it was the end of the world. I thought it was the hardest thing in the world. As they got into adolescence, I'm like, oh man, this is so hard. It feels like the end of the world. And now that I'm on the other side of that, there's even greater decisions that we're trying to figure out. And so how you respond as a parent today in this season of adolescence is beginning to even continue to build that relationship that you're going to have for the long haul with your children. So let me give you 6 things as just real practical steps of our responsibility as parents in standing beneath the tightrope. So did that switch? Let me go to the next one. Let me see here. I'm going to advance this manually. There we go. So a parent's role, standing beneath the tightrope. Let me give you 6 quick things as we talk about that. There we go. First one is this: learn to practice understanding. Learn to practice understanding. I would kind of break this down into a couple things. One would be to understand their world. To be a student of your child. One of the things I know, at least when our children are little, like even before they were born, like we were some of the greatest learners of the developmental cycle that our kids were going through. We knew exactly what they were going to, when they were going to leave the bottle and when they were going to get on to more solid food. We knew exactly when we assumed that they would move from crawling into walking. We knew all these developmental characteristics of our kid. Somewhere along the way, and I'm not sure why, somewhere along the way, we stopped learning. We stopped trying to really understand our children. And so that's why I gave you the front end material, is for you to become a student of your adolescent so that you can understand some of the developmental needs that they're going through so that you have a better understanding of who they are. And so I would encourage you, practice understanding. Know the culture that your kids are living in. Again, don't assume, oh, I was in high school once, I know what they're dealing with. You weren't in this high school. You weren't in this season. And so continue to be a student of your child. Know their culture. Stay in tune with the decision your child's making, what's going on in their lives. And then I would say this: understand their emotions. When you talk about practice and understanding, you can understand kind of their developmental stuff, but also understanding their emotions. In other words, be present with what's going on with them. Because like I said, in early adolescence, they're not feeling that lovable, right? I mean, there's physical changes that they might look in the mirror every day and feel like they look ugly. And so they're going to act out in some ways at times because they just feel ugly because of something that's going on. It could be a zit that popped up in the middle of their forehead. And so they feel like the whole school sees it. They feel like they're the ugliest person walking through the room. And if you just kind of callously go get over it, you're not practicing understanding of what's really going on in the heart of that child. And so I would try to say just, understand their emotions and be emotionally present with them. I can remember there's times where my kids acted out in some ways, and my initial reaction was to just kind of lose it and to come down hard in some form of discipline. And yet I was in the midst of understanding this and trying this, and I just found myself going, it was wiser for me to just back up a little bit, take a deep breath, and go, I wonder why they're acting that way. I wonder why they're feeling that way. And it really did allow me to have more empathy than I naturally have as a parent. And so I would encourage you, your role as a parent, one of those is to really practice understanding. Understand their emotions, be a present, be a good listener to them. And then that goes along with what I wanted to say next was just demonstrate compassion. This is a hard world. I mean, there's a lot being weighed down on your child's life. And so one of the things that we get to offer them is just some compassion, more than just understanding. That just compels me, and this is more than just understanding, it compels me to come alongside them, just to be able to say with them, hey, I'm in it with you. You're not alone. You're not going through this alone. Like, your mom, your dad, our extended family, we feel you, and we want to demonstrate some compassion with you. Third one is this: provide some boundaries. Discipline is a proactive commitment to correct, instruct, and train someone for growth. And so really it's the opportunity for you to provide some healthy boundaries, to extend the fence, as you need to, give them more responsibility when there's necessary ways that you can give them more responsibility. But it also means maybe bringing that fence back in when they abuse some of the freedoms that we give them. But part of being a parent in the season is allowing them some flexibility to try some things out, to step beyond some boundaries so that they can see what it's like. And so that's our responsibility as well. Fourth one is this: learn to say I'm sorry. Learn to say I'm sorry. I know for me as a parent, I messed up often. I misunderstood my kids often. I said some things I shouldn't have said often. I didn't allow some things I might have should allowed often. And so part of just trying to be a parent of grace and offer some love and compassion to my kids was learning how to say I'm sorry, more so than always trying to defend myself. Fifth one is this: model and teach your values. Model and teach values. Yes, your kids are going to be influenced by a lot of other sources. But as parents, we still have one of the primary responsibilities in our child's life to influence them. And so we get to teach and model the values that are important to our families. And then, number 6, I would encourage you to provide a parenting community. Provide a parenting community. Here's what I know about society today is extended families don't live as close in proximity as they once did. Right? Because of mobilization, we're scattered all over the place. Because of how we live in our neighborhoods these days, we come in and we close the garage door and it's just us and our family. And so what I would encourage you to do is begin to provide a parenting community. Times have changed. Generally speaking, kids are not growing up with the network of support that many of us and our parents grew up with. And so young people in modern society, they grow up with less adult interaction from any generation in human history. Sadly, the intergenerational connection that is critical to identity formation is threatened by the invisibility of adults as much as their absence. Mobility, as I said a moment ago, has contributed to less intergenerational contact with extended family, further resulting in the youth developing a subculture apart from the influence of caring adults. And so let me take you back to that tightrope for a minute. If this is a 15-year tightrope of adolescence where these kids are trying to figure out life and we come alongside and we play the role and we do some of our part, there's another key aspect of that, really, when it comes to that last one of providing a parenting community. And as you look at this tightrope, again, we've said it's a long season and there's plenty of opportunities to fall off the tightrope. But one of the things that we get to do in providing an extended parenting community is we get to begin to build out some of these little mini trampolines underneath that tightrope, if you will, of other caring adults. And I just listed a few. Maybe it's some coaches, or some of its teachers, or some of its neighbors, or some of its youth leaders in your faith community. And so there's all these other little contexts where we begin to find other adults that are going to help us raise our children in a way that says they're going to be healthy through this adolescent season and as they move into adulthood. And it really is this whole ideal of convergence and congruence. Convergence is like, how can I find 5 other adults that are going to kind of love on my child in a way that it's not just me as a parent feeling the full weight of responsibility to love and to guide that parent, that child. And then it's also congruence, because those 5 adults, I would hope, would be saying the same things that I'm saying. So they're encouraging my kid in the same ways that I would encourage my kid. And so one of the things that I tried to do in that season of life for my kids was I began to find some of these people. And I began to ask them intentionally, like, hey, would you help me? Would you partner with me in helping me walk these kids through adolescence? Because I wanted my kids to know that it wasn't just me that cared about their health and their development, but it was a whole community of people that cared about them. And so I would often ask them, like, hey, if you're at school and you need something, who's that adult that you would go to? If you're out in our community and there's another adult that you would call if you needed something, who was that other adult? Because I wanted them to have those kind of relationships, not just with me and their mom, but I wanted them to have that with other caring adults. And I can remember one of my daughters was trying out for a volleyball team when she was in junior high, and it was a big deal for her, right? And so I can remember that at that time she did have a cell phone and she was texting, and she texted some of these adults in her life that were not me and her mom, and just said, hey, I want y'all to know I'm trying out for volleyball. And so at the end of that, obviously she put herself out there because we didn't know if she was going to make the team or not make the team. Luckily, she did make the team, and those adults were able to celebrate that accomplishment with her. And so that was a win for us because we knew that there was a broader community of a parenting community that we had put around our kids, and we were able to see that pay off in our daughter's life. And so I want to encourage you, as you think about these people in your life, you know, who are you giving that level of access to your kids? How can you encourage them to be an encouragement to your kid? And then let me just kind of, again, finish up with this thought here on the very end. Let me get this slide going again. And these are kind of my closing words, and then we'll see if there's any questions. It started with this, but I want to bring it up here at the end. Adolescents are not a problem to be solved. They're not a problem to be solved, but they're creative, they're talented, and they're unique gifts to be understood, embraced, and ultimately set free. And so hopefully we walk away today having a better understanding of this tightrope of adolescence. You understand kind of your role as a parent and really what it looks like to surround yourself with a community of people to help your kids win. So we'll see if there's any questions before we wrap it up.
Dr. Alston, someone asked, what is your thought on kids having social media, and when is an okay time to let them have a platform?
Yep. So the question asked was, what are my thoughts on allowing kids to have social media, and at what age should they be allowed to have a platform? I'm assuming in these Friendswood ISD parent forums, we're going to have a whole forum on technology and parenting and all that kind of stuff, because that is such a critical issue. And it really is a personal issue for each individual family. So I can give you some of our thought process as we allowed our children to begin to move into that, as they did begin to have a little more freedom moving into the junior high years, where we were going to be leaving them after school to stay for extracurricular activities and kind of extend their social network a little longer. We wanted to have a connection with them, and so it was in those junior high years that we did allow our kids to have that, and that was for our social connection to be able to stay tied to them. And yet we know today there's a lot of parameters that go with that. Luckily, there's a lot of devices that allow you to put some barriers and restrictions and some controls on that, because there are some things out there that a junior high student isn't ready for. And so I think we should be wise as parents and kind of how we restrict some of their usage on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was
Okay.
all we had.
All right. Well, it's been good to be with you guys today. Hopefully you'll tune in again for future parenting power sessions with Friendswood ISD. Thanks for letting me share with you today.